Leonard wrote crooks with a shrug and a grin. Le Guin built whole worlds were the troubles within. Laymen yelled run while the shadows grew near. Tanith Lee purred, darling, there's nothing to fear. Lovecraft just whimpered, I knew it was cursed. And Fritz Leiber drank last, but somehow wrote first. Hello, welcome to my channel. Another Bibliophile Reads. My name is Greg, and today I am doing another installment of my basement book tour, where I'm attempting to show you each and every book that I own that I keep in my basement. I am still working on my mass market paperbacks, and today I will continue with the letter L. So I will switch the camera angle because it's just a little bit easier to show you each book individually without having to hold it up and show my mug at the same time. Barabbas by Lagerkvist, translated from the Swedish. Barabbas by Lagerkvist, translated from the Swedish. Lagerkvist won the Nobel Prize in Literature. This is an historical story of the thief Barabbas, who was supposed to be executed with Jesus Christ, but the crowd gave him clemency when Pontius Pilate said you can release one of the people to be crucified. And this is his story of his spiritual struggles. I really liked it when I first read it in the 80s, but upon rereading it this May, I was less impressed. The Sibyl by Lagerkvist, also translated from the Swedish. This is another book that I read in the 80s. I don't really actually remember a lot about this book, other than it is about a soothsayer, and it is a historical novel. Mainspring by J. Lake, a science fiction novel published in 2007. This is a steampunk novel that I have not read. Steampunk back in the aughts was kind of a popular genre. I don't know if it's as popular now as it was back then, but I did read a few steampunk novels, which made me go out and buy this one, even though I have not read it yet. Genghis Khan, Emperor of All Men by Harold Lamb. This is an historical novel of Genghis Khan. It was originally published in 1927. The fascinating story of a barbarian who conquered half the world and made the name Mughal a cry of terror down the centuries. I have not read this. I picked this up at a thrift store the first week that I moved to Virginia when I lived in Washington. It's something I need to read someday. The Daybreakers by Louis L'Amour. I have a bunch of Louis L'Amour books. Some of them I've read, some of them I haven't. This is one that I tried to read for June on the Range in 2023, but I got distracted, and maybe it is a June on the Range book that I should pick up again for 2026. It is supposedly one of Louis L'Amour's best novels. Borden Chantry by Louis L'Amour. This is a Western mystery. I did read this book. I think I read it in 2023. It was okay. I did not know it'd be a mystery novel going into it. I think Louis L'Amour does better with Westerns than mysteries. The First Fast Draw by Louis L'Amour. I picked this up at a thrift store, dirt cheap. I haven't read it. Jubal Sackett, Louis L'Amour, another one I haven't read. Kilroan by Louis L'Amour, another one that I haven't read. But these old covers of these old Westerns are just works of art in and of themselves. They really put a lot of effort into making a painting on the cover of books back then. Milo Talon by Louis L'Amour. Taggart by Louis L'Amour. The Far Side of the Blue Mountains. This is part of his Sackett's trilogy, or Sackett's series. The Trail to Crazy Man by Louis L'Amour, featuring The Trail to Crazy Man, Riders of the Dawn, and Showdown on the Hogback. It has 3 books in one, apparently, the only authorized edition. Ride the River, Louis L'Amour, Sackett's number 17. The Sackett Brand, Louis L'Amour. Sackett's Land, Louis L'Amour. Shalako, Louis L'Amour. The Quick and the Dead by Louis L'Amour. This is the first Louis L'Amour book that I read, and it's actually my favorite, about a gunslinger, a man who has to defend a family. Confessions of a Warlock by Curtis Lavender. A practicing warlock reveals the dark rituals and bizarre secrets of the devil's art. Strange, sinister, spellbinding, the real story of witchcraft in America, told for the first time ever. This is supposedly nonfiction. It is almost certainly entirely fiction. It is actually a really poorly written book. The chapters are completely uneven. The writing style is not consistent. And I kind of have a feeling that this book may have had more than one author using the name Curtis Lavender, because the chapters just did not fit. Now, I came across this book a number of times in my life. I first had a copy when I was growing up in high school and read the first chapter. It is about a warlock taking sexual advantage of a 15-year-old girl with her parents' consent, because they're all part of the cult of Satan. It really is just not a good book. Midnight's Lair by Richard Lehman. What can I say about Richard Lehman? He's a bit of a pervert. He has a strong fascination with women's body parts, and all of his novels describe them quite lovingly and frequently. This is about a monster or two in an underground cave where people are trapped. The Stake, Richard Lehman. I have not actually read this Richard Lehman book before. I have read quite a number of his books, but not this one. I'm fairly certain this one is about a vampire. Blood Flies by Jean Luzata, a new breed of horror. Now they sleep, soon they swarm. This is some sort of killer animal book, I believe. I have not read it, but I do love collecting killer animal books. The Looking Glass War by Jean Le Carré from 1964. This is one of his early spy novels. It was actually pretty good. The Naive and Sentimental Lover by Jean Le Carré. This is not a spy book. This is Le Carré's second novel. It was his attempt, if I'm not mistaken, to write a contemporary novel. I don't hear a lot of people saying a lot of good things about this book, but I picked it up dirt cheap at a thrift store. The Russia House by Jean Le Carré. This was originally published in 1988. It is Jean Le Carré's attempt to redefine the genre of espionage after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I have not read it yet. The Spy Who Came In From the Cold by Jean Le Carré. This is my favorite Le Carré novel. It is a George Smiley novel, but upon reading this book, you're not quite sure about George Smiley being in this book. But as I said in other criticisms, George Smiley is all over every page, and you don't recognize it until you do. The Ugly American by William J. Lederer. and Eugene Burdick. This is a novel originally published in 1958. It caused quite a scandal back then because it did not portray America kindly, if I'm not mistaken. The back says, is President Kennedy's Peace Corps the answer to the problem raised by this book? If this were not a free country, this book would be banned. A bombshell. I have to read this someday. Ghouls by Edward Lee, originally published in 1988. This is the Zebra edition. This was a novel Edward Lee published early on in his career, and he was not quite up to the splatterpunk reputation that he would be known for later on, but is a fairly good horror novel with a fairly interesting and unique set of monsters. Creakers by Edward Lee. This is about cannibalistic hillbillies in the backwoods of Virginia. And this is Edward Lee getting into his splatterpunk phase. There's a lot of discrimination against rural folk, in my opinion, but it's still a fascinating horror novel. Sacrifice by Richard Kinneon. You're asking why is the letter K in with Edward Lee? That is because Richard Kinneon is the pseudonym for Edward Lee. This is one of his early novels. I have not read it yet, but I hope to read it sometime in 2026. It might be a buddy read with a friend. Knight's Master by Tanith Lee, an adult fantasy originally published in 1978. This is part of her Flat Earth series. Death's Master by Tanith Lee, the second book in the Flat Earth series. Delusion's Master by Tanith Lee, an adult fantasy, the third book in the Flat Earth series. Delirium's Mistress by Tanith Lee, Tales from the Flat Earth, book number 4. Night's Sorceress, Tales from the Flat Earth, book number 5. Swords and Deviltry by Fritz Lieber. This is the first of the Fafford and Grey Mouser series. This is a collection of short sword and sorcery short stories. I have read this book before, and as you will see, I have the other books that I have not read yet. Swords Against Death, the second book in the Fafford and Grey Mouser series. Swords Against the Mist, the third book in the Fafford and Grey Mouser series. Swords and Ice Magic, the fifth book in the Fafford and Grey Mouser series. The Night of the Wolf by Fritz Lieber. This is a collection of 4 novellas. I'm not sure if they're science fiction, fantasy, or horror. You can look at the top. The first novella, a middle-aged novelist wonders why his best friend brings his wife the mask of a 17-year-old sexpot and him a robot secretary. The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. I have read this book, I think, twice. It is my favorite Le Guin novel. It is the story of an ice planet and a offshoot of the human species that does not quite have fixed genders. They are sometimes a neutral gender, and then they can switch to male or female. It really is a great science fiction novel. The Word for World is Forest by Ursula K. Le Guin, originally published in 1972 in Harlan Ellison's anthology, Again Dangerous Visions. This is Le Guin's take on the Vietnam War. I read it once in high school. Didn't quite get what Le Guin was getting at, but I read it a few years ago and finally it clicked. The older me understood the Vietnam analogies. The Wind's 12 Quarters by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is a collection of short stories. I think this contains two of her best short stories, which include The Ones Who Walk Away from Olmus, which is basically my favorite all-time science fiction short story, and then Vaster Than Empires and More Slow. I remember Vaster Than Empires and More Slow because when I was a freshman in college, there was a introduction to English class that had an anthology of short stories, and Vaster Than Empires and More Slow was included in that anthology, even though it didn't have very many science fiction stories. So that one always stuck out in my mind. The Chains of Chance by Stanislaw Lem, translated from the Polish. Stanislaw Lem was behind the Iron Curtain writing and had a lot of difficulties writing science fiction back then, but he had such a brilliant mind, and science fiction suited him quite well. This is one of his novels that I have not read. This one, I believe, was done in the 70s. Most of Lem's work are from the 60s and 70s. The Cyberad. This is a collection of stories about robots, of course, translated from the Polish. The Investigation by Stanislaw Lem. This is actually one of his few non-science fiction novels. This is a mystery. I read it in the late 80s, maybe the early 90s. I can't quite remember. I remember liking it, but not loving it. The Futurological Congress by Stanislaw Lem. This is from the 70s. This is one of his better known novels. I read it about 12 years ago. One Human Minute by Stanislaw Lem. This is a collection of book reviews. The only thing is, none of these books have been written, and some of these books I don't think could be written by human beings. The Star Diaries by Stanislaw Lem. This is a collection of short stories about one of his characters named Paperbacks. He is an astronaut. I think the short stories sort of turn this into a novel, but I'm not 100% sure. Tales of Paperbacks the Pirate by Stanislaw Lem. This is more short stories of his character, Paperbacks. Bandits by Elmore Leonard, an autographed copy. Elmore Leonard was one of America's treasures as an author. He did westerns and he did crime, and he did both very well. And if you want to see what his signature looks like, it's right there. I did not have this signed to me. I found this at a used bookstore. The Bounty Hunters by Elmore Leonard, a western. Escape from Five Shadows by Elmore Leonard, a western. Cuba by Elmore Leonard. This is an historical novel. It begins in Cuba in 1898 when there are insurrectionists in the hills outside of Havana, and Teddy Roosevelt is about to land on Cuba. Valdez is Coming by Elmore Leonard, a western. Trail of the Apache and Other Stories by Elmore Leonard, western stories. 310 to Yuma and Other Stories by Elmore Leonard, another collection of western short stories. A Hero of Our Time by Mikhail Lermontov, translated from the Russian by Vladimir and Dmitry Nabokov. If I am not mistaken, Vladimir did not have a lot to do with this translation. Most of it came from Dmitry, his son. If you are not familiar with Vladimir Nabokov, he is more famously known for his novel Lolita, but he originally came from Russia. He wrote his first few books in Russian, and he is also a notorious translator of Russian poetry. He did a volume of Pushkin, which some people praise as brilliant, and some people say is absolute rubbish. Now, I did read this novel, A Hero of Our Time, in a different translation when I was at the University of Maryland. Mikhail Lermontov is more famously known in Russia as a poet. It was a fairly interesting novel. Briefing for a Descent into Hell by Doris Lessing. Doris Lessing did win the Nobel Prize in Literature, and this is a novel described as an excursion into private consciousness, beginning with everyday mentality and ending up in the darkest reaches of the unconscious at its most primitive. Haven't read it. Motherless Brooklyn by Jonathan Latham, originally published in 1999. This is a spin on the detective novel. Came a Spider by Edward Levy. This is a killer animal novel about spiders on the loose. I think it was Los Angeles, don't quote me, somewhere in California. As a killer animal novel, it was okay, but definitely not the best that genre has to offer. The Beast Within by Edward Levy. This is another horror novel. They did make it into a cheesy horror novel sometime in the 80s. I only saw bits and pieces of the movie in clips. I have not read the book. But as I understand it, the movie and the book really don't match up too well. The Spiders by Richard Lewis, a killer animal novel from 1978 about, you guessed it, spiders. It was a fairly decent killer animal novel. Again, not the best of its genre, but good enough for fun reading. Night Killers by Richard Lewis, another killer animal novel. This one featured a mutant form of cockroach. Not as good as spiders. Devil's Coach Horse by Richard Lewis, about killer beetles. This is the British edition of the paperback. The Black Horde by Richard Lewis, about killer beetles. This is actually just the Devil's Coach Horse in an American edition with an American title. I don't know why the publisher felt necessary to give it a new title. I did read this book back when I was in high school, probably 82 or 83. It's okay. The House by Bentley Little, originally published in 1999. Bentley Little has a solid list of horror novels that he has written. A lot of people like him, but he's never made it into the big stream like Stephen King or Dean R. Koontz. I have read some of Bentley Little's novels. I enjoyed them well enough, but I have not read this one. Songs of a Dead Dreamer by Thomas Ligotti. This is a collection of horror short stories. He is a fascinating horror writer. I believe he has only done short stories. I don't think he's currently active publishing short stories, but in the 80s and 90s, he was a big name in the horror short story market, and he has written some of the best short stories in that genre of that time. Scorpion by Michael R. Laniker, a killer animal novel about, of course, scorpions. I know Criminali read this book and he was not all that impressed. He thought it was going to be about giant scorpions, but I think these scorpions are just about the size of cats. Still kind of nasty to have a scorpion that big. But this is part of that killer animal genre. Lest Earth Be Conquered by Frank Belknap Long. Long was a contemporary of Lovecraft in his early days. This is a science fiction novel that he wrote later in his career. Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos, Volume 1, edited by August Derleth. Lovecraft does get the headline on this book, although he only has one short story in this collection. This is part of the Bantam paperbacks, which were available when I was in high school. I really love these covers. I used to have all of them, but over the years I have gotten rid of them, and that is a darn shame because they're really great paperback covers. Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos, Volume 2. The Shuttered Room and Other Tales of Horror by H.P. Lovecraft and August Derleth. Again, having H.P. Lovecraft listed as the main author is a bit disingenuous. If I am not mistaken, the stories in this collection are just taken from notes that Lovecraft had in his notebooks that would say, hey, why don't I write a story about a bauble? And that might be all that he wrote. So Derleth came along and wrote a short story about a bauble. I have read a few of these short stories. They're okay. The Lurker at the Threshold by H.P. Lovecraft and August Derleth. Again, August Derleth is really the main author. I read a copy of this way back in high school, 82, 83, somewhere around there. I don't remember a darn thing about this story. The Spawn of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft and others. Lovecraft has one short story in this collection. Other than that, it's just other writers in the Cthulhu mythos genre. Lovecraft, A Look Behind the Cthulhu Mythos by Lynn Carter. This is a work of literary nonfiction examining the Cthulhu mythos. Always fun to show the front and back covers of these editions. H.P. Lovecraft, Fungi from Yuggoth and Other Poems. This is a collection of Lovecraft's poems. I have read a few of his poems. Lovecraft is really a much better short story writer than a poet. The Aquitaine Progression by Robert Ludlum. Robert Ludlum was a fantastically popular author back in the 80s and 90s when I was working at Crown Books. All of his novels made it to the bestseller list. The Gemini Contenders by Robert Ludlum. The Osterman Weekend by Robert Ludlum, originally published in 1972. I did read this one a few years ago. It's a good thriller to read over about a weekend. Entertaining. Necroscope by Brian Lumley, originally published in 1986. This is the first novel in a series about vampires. Michael K. Vaughan gave this a fairly good review a number of years ago, and then when I saw it at a used bookstore, I just had to buy it. So I blame Michael K. Vaughan for me picking up this book. I still have to read it. The Sunset Warrior by Eric van Lustbader. This is the first in the trilogy of fantasy books, originally published in 1977. It says, the first in his trilogy about the ultimate nightmare and the ultimate man. Van Lustbader is better known for his story, The Ninja, about an American trained as a ninja. I did read The Ninja, and I read the second book in that series, The Mako, or something like that. These are books that is picked up at a used bookstore, dirt cheap, to read someday. The Shallows of Night, the second in the trilogy. Thy Son by Eric van Lustbader, the third in the trilogy. Okay, those are all my mass market paperbacks of authors beginning with the letter L. Was there any specific title that caught your interest? Let me know in the comments. Onward to the M's. Thank you for watching and keep on reading.